But anyways, I'll go ahead and kick it off. So thank you everybody for joining us. We will be sending out a copy of this PDF of this PowerPoint presentation this evening, as well as we'll be posting a live recording onto our YouTube page. So feel free to follow us on IFAS Extension Alachua County on YouTube. And from there, you'll be able to get a copy of it, etc. So I would like to thank Scott Shupe for joining us today, our Master Gardener volunteer. He's going to be teaching about summer vegetable gardening. And I know there's always a lot of questions about summer vegetable gardening here, especially in Alachua County, or at least here in Florida, because there's a lot of challenges that are associated with it. So Scott, I'd like to thank you for coming, and feel free, anybody that has any questions or anything like that, send them in the chat box or the Q&A, and our Master Gardeners will be able to help respond to them. Thank you very much, and Scott, thank you for helping out, and you can take it over from here.
Okay, very good. Welcome, everybody. Let's get started with the agenda for today. North Florida, as Taylor just mentioned, has got a very unique climate for growing things. If you're from South Florida, it's very different, and if you're from much further north than we are, say the Midwest or the Northeast, again, it's such an extremely different climate. So a lot of things when it comes to the climate here, the gardening just completely changes. In the summertime, as I have grown several of these vegetables that I'm going to talk about, some of them are fun, some of them are interesting, and some of them are just flat downright difficult to get going properly. So, and I'll mention that as we go through this. The other things I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some other ideas, what I call the working vacation, where I go on vacation, but I leave my garden working. But that's kind of a different thing, and I'll get to that. And then we're going to go through some other things as far as caring for your garden and things that you should think about doing, because summertime, at least in my opinion, is a great downtime for the garden. If you're from a long ways up north, you should think about Florida summertime as the winter, where you're really not doing a heck of a lot, except down here you get the chance to maintain some soil or do some work with your soil. So let's keep going. Most people, like I said earlier, are very used to growing vegetables throughout the summer, where here it's very different, and that's because the climate is so different. My personal favorite time to grow vegetables is the fall season, and I kind of look at that from after Labor Day until New Year's Day is that window of it's a great window to grow. The only thing that's a little off here is, of course, the hours of sunlight really decreases, so it's really difficult to grow things. Tomatoes do very well, but they don't ripen because the sunlight isn't really there. But then we get going right away. I know I put on here February to May. I start my summer vegetables, quote unquote, or this time of the year, I start that in January in my greenhouse because I know we're going to get a few freezes. All right, so summertime. Because we're in a subtropical climate, and really here, if you look at this little graphic that I have on your screen, from the Tropic of Cancer north to that dotted line is considered subtropical, even though I think that dotted line is a little bit too far north in my opinion. But Florida in the summertime is definitely a subtropical climate, which really changes a lot of the things that we can grow, and it also changes the things that we can do. You'll notice that I put monsoon rains. That's my inside joke for those of you that know me. I spent time in the military, and actually monsoons are just another way of saying hurricane, but a lot of people in this country don't realize that. And we get them, unfortunately, in the summertime, and it can be, of course, a blessing and a curse, as we all know. Okay, the other thing that really makes it tough to grow vegetables in the summertime, and I pointed this out on the podcast, and I believe Taylor released that podcast today, that we talked about some of the alternatives that we have for gardening in the summer. And the thing that makes it difficult is, as I've noted here on the screen, pests. I mean, insects go bananas here. Weeds, absolutely. It's almost like that is wheat. If you had a crop of weeds, weed season is the summertime. Diseases thrive, fungus thrives, and because of that's one of the big reasons why vegetables, traditional vegetables, really struggle during that time period. And you really have to, if you're going to garden, vegetable gardening during this time of the year, during the summertime, and what do I mean by summertime? Let's kind of quantify that. I call summertime June, July, August. That is, and it's kind of started a little bit right now. We can feel that humidity just starting to creep into our climate now. And we all know that 2 weeks from now, it's going to be humid every day, and you can almost set the clock at the 4 o'clock thunderstorm that's going to come rumble through here. So selecting the right things that are, you know, kind of disease resistant, a little bit disease resistant, or resist pests, those things are important in selecting if you want to grow vegetables in the summer. So as I mentioned earlier, what I call this is a great time to consider winter work. But some of those things that would be considered winter work down here, like solarizing soil, planting cover crops, which is what I traditionally do, and I'll go into some detail with regard to that. But the other things that you do is it's time to, if you have raised beds, if you need any repairs that you need to do, if you till your beds, that's a good time to be tilling your beds, etc. Okay, let's talk about soil solarization. Now the picture that I have up on your screen is one of my beds, and I did decide to solarize my soil because I had never done it before. And I wanted to understand, and I'm one of those people that basically I can read it in a book and I can listen to somebody on a presentation, but until I do it myself, you know, the book and the listening and the lectures get me half of the way there, and then the other half is really that firsthand experience. So what's important when it comes to soil solarization, one of the things I want you to note in some of the pictures that you'll see that I have here is you have to use translucent or opaque plastic. And the reason you want to do that, not meaning black and not being a white plastic or a colored plastic, is you want that short wave radiation from the sun to actually go through. Okay, you want some of the sunlight to get through that plastic or that sheeting, because that is what is going to heat your soil up. Now, why do we want to heat the soil up? And it does heat the soil up. Soil temperatures can reach as high as 130 degrees in the right conditions under direct sunlight in the summertime using this method. You're going to do that for a couple reasons. A, it's going to kill weeds. It's going to kill weed seeds. And most importantly, those of you that are seasoned North Florida gardeners, it will greatly diminish the life expectancy of nematodes here in your raised beds. Or it doesn't necessarily even need to be a raised bed. Here you'll see there's a picture, and that's not my garden, but is a great picture of a solarized a field that had a cover crop growing underneath it. And then covered, and then they, instead of putting weights or bricks on top of it, they just put dirt and sand, well, it's really kind of sand, on top to weight that translucent film down. So like I said in the slide here, you have to have an unshaded area. You want to get rid of weeds and debris. If you till your soil, you want to till prior to solarizing it because it'll increase the depth in which the heat will make it through, okay? And the biggest thing that you're trying to do, as I said, if anybody's experienced, especially root knot or lance nematodes, they are a headache in and of themselves. So if you ever have a problem, especially with tomatoes, for whatever reason, they love tomatoes. If you have a tomato plant that just doesn't seem to be doing well, pull it up by the roots kind of at the end of the season and look at them. If the roots don't look right, you definitely have nematodes. So it's important. One thing that I learned, and I learned this the hard way, is when you're going to do this, you definitely want to tuck in the edges around the sides, and it's not has nothing to do with water, but that is going to keep the heat inside of under the surface of your clear plastic. That's a very important point. Okay, cover crops. This is my main crop that I produce during the summertime. And I can tell you, typically my cover crop for this summer is going to be usually I do 4 or 5 different crops, because I don't, Mother Nature doesn't monocrop, and I don't believe that we should either necessarily as home gardeners, especially if we're going to do a cover crop. So typical cover crops, and Taylor, if you want to come in here, I know another thing you probably want to email out. You and I co-authored that county paper on cover crops. Why don't you include that, because it'll give you examples of all the different cover crops that are really recommended here in Alachua County. This year, what did you say, Taylor?
Oh, I said gladly. That I think.
Yeah, I think that just makes sense, because then everybody will have that information to go along with this if you're going to go ahead and do cover crops. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I do cover crops. I'm a no-till organic gardener, so this is how I am building my soil over the course of time. I'm using cover crops, and obviously I do an awful lot. I produce roughly 1 yard to 1.5 yards of compost every year, and I use that compost at the end of this particular cycle. So I will cover crop, and this year I'm using 4 different things as an example. I've got what's pictured here on the screen is buckwheat. I'm adding millet, hairy vetch, and then a bean also. So I have 2 nitrogen fixers in there, and then 2 that are really just green manure producers. But the thing that's nice about the buckwheat is it is also provides for pollinators. It's a pollination source and a nectar source for honeybees. So the biggest thing that you'll see is weed control at the end of the cycle. And I will cover crop. I'll typically put my cover crop in the 2nd week, 3rd week of June, and I will cut that down and lay it on the surface 45 to 60 days later. You want to cut your cover crops, and I cut it right at the level of the soil using a hedge clippers, and I lay everything down just simply on top of my soil, and I let the Florida sun beat the heck out of it, and then I'll let it that way for 10 days or so, and then I'll take all this compost that I've produced across the summer in early August, and I'll put that on top of this cover crop, and that starts the process of breaking down my cover crop and really building new soil that I'm going to plant into come right after Labor Day. Well, right after Labor Day, I start my seeds. I'll do that in flats, and then I'll transplant in late September and early October all my fall vegetables. What does this do? The number one thing that it really does is obviously build soil, but you're also going to control weeds, because when you cut this cover crop, without exaggerating, I mean, it's a 6-inch mat that's laying on the surface of my soil. So I have cut all these different plants. And for those of you that don't know, millet is kind of a grass. Vetch is very small, but it's also kind of a grass. It's some people call that hairy indigo too. And then the beans you don't want to let anything go to seed. So when you start seeing, and that's kind of my indicator, when the buckwheat starts to bloom, okay, and the beans will start to cast their pods, that's when it's time to cut. Because if you go to seeds, then you're just going to produce another crop. You don't want those seeds to drop into the soil, okay? And the biggest thing that this does for me, that process of layering, is it is just really driving my soil food web, which is, as an organic gardener, absolutely the key to nutrient cycling and production of those plants. So To incorporate cover crops, like I just mentioned, I chop and drop. Some people will chop and then till in. I don't do any tilling, but that's certainly something that you can do if you think about farmers in their fields. A lot of times, think of a cornfield. You'll see farmers will cut their corn, and as soon as that gets out of their storage and onto the marketplace, they'll go and turn their soil over and turn all those stalks back into the soil. But I don't. I chop and drop, and I drop compost then on top of it about 2 weeks after I chop it. All right, here's some of the stuff that we've talked about, and these are just a few examples of things that you can use for cover crop. Now, what's pictured there, I grew that one year. That is sun hemp. I would strongly caution, that's a good way to put it. I would strongly caution against using sun hemp because it grows great here. It is a sun-bathing champion, and it's prolific. But the problem, and it's great because it produces a very thick mat of green manure. But it's very fibrous, and it takes a very long time. It was when I grew that one year because I'd never done it, so I'm one of those people where I got to try it. It's recommended in this environment. Well, it was literally easily a year before that was really, you could tell, okay, that is pretty much disintegrated into the soil. So it's a long cycle time because of the fibrous nature of those stalks on that. Okay, let's talk about some of the vegetables that we can grow, which is something I laugh because I even made the comment on the podcast that Taylor and I did with regards to summer vegetable gardening. And we talked about a lot of things and we didn't talk about hardly any vegetables. One of the things that's really important that I would note in the stuff that I've done is days to maturity. Now, where a lot of people, if you're brand new to gardening or you're not familiar with, if you look on the back of your seed pack, you're going to always see it'll give you plant spacing, planting depth if you're going from seed, and days to maturity will be on there. And that days to maturity is very accurate for when you're going to be able to harvest your first fruits. Okay, that doesn't mean that the whole crop is going to get done, because think about some of the vegetables that okra is a great example, where okra, I have grown okra, started it in June, and I was still harvesting okra well into November, December, because I just let it go. I wanted to see how long it would go. So then you also have to look at, when you do days of maturity, are you going to go directly from seed or are you going to do transplants? I typically do transplants just because I find that more convenient for controlling the amount of spacing and the amount of stuff I need to plant. Okay, the other thing that I want to talk about, and we did mention this on the podcast, and I didn't really talk about it in here, and it kind of has to do with design and care for your garden. If you're doing raised beds and you're using fertilization, but another thing you have to think about is crop rotation. Now, I pictured here on the screen is a great, it's one of the few things that I truly love to eat, but I typically grow it in the fall. And as a matter of fact, most people grow it in the fall. And a lot of people think that that's bok choy, but it's not. But that's another thing you can grow. But what I mean by, when I talk about rotating your garden, is if you have a plant that is very dependent on a particular macro nutrient, let's say a nitrogen lover, well, you don't want to constantly be putting those things in the same place, because you're going to, I mean, nitrogen leaves our soil very rapidly, especially in the summertime, because rain washes it out of the soil. And if you're constantly putting the same plant in the same place all the time when it comes to vegetable gardening, you're going to be draining that area of your garden from the nutrients that plant needs the most. So it is very important to move those things around your garden. So I always suggest, tomatoes need to move, squash needs to move, And as beans need to move. Now, beans are a great nitrogen fixer. And that's another thing when it comes to crop rotation. If you plant beans in, let's say, during the summertime, well, beans fix nitrogen, meaning they pull nitrogen from the soil and they store it in their root systems, in these little nodules that they have in their root systems. Well, instead of pulling those beans up by the roots, if you just clip them at the soil, that nitrogen is going to be available for the next crop that comes in. So if you're doing something in the summer that is a nitrogen fixer, you might want to plant stuff like kale or broccoli, stuff that really it needs a lot of nitrogen to produce its crop. And that's something just to keep in mind as you're going along here. Okay, let's talk about some vegetables that do grow very well here in the summertime. Sun gold tomatoes. It's not just sun golds. I put those in here because I've been very successful growing sun gold tomatoes here, and I personally really like them. They're very sweet. They make for great caprese salad, to be honest with you, cutting in half. But cherry tomatoes as a whole, they are very heat tolerant. You just got to provide them a fair amount of water and a good amount of fertilizer at least once a month roughly, and you'll have a really good crop. For whatever reasons, cherry tomatoes do great here in North Florida during the summertime. Heat-resistant tomatoes, I have tried some. Tomatoes are my favorite crop to grow. They're my favorite vegetable that I grow. I actually am trying to breed my own tomatoes and stabilize some genetics right now, which is not an easy task. I have not had tremendous success with the heat-tolerant tomatoes personally, but I know some people that have had. One of my neighbors, who is also an avid gardener, has had tremendous success growing the Florida 91 tomato, which was developed here at UF. Okay, hot peppers. Well, I grow about 6 different kinds of peppers. I already have them started, and that's a part of my garden that I will not cover crop. Those stuff that are listed in here, and I would tell you another thing that does do well here, and I like to mention it because our leader, our chief, Taylor spent several years out in the New Mexico in the Four Corners, near the Four Corners, and the Hatch chili, or the Hatch pepper, grows very well here in North Florida. So that's another one I would add to this list. But any of the really hot tomatoes, peppers, and I personally, I grow Thai and cayenne chilies, and they do very well here in North Florida. Now, some hot weather spinach. I have not grown, and I've pictured here a couple that I know other people have grown and have done very well with here. I have grown the Malabar. I grew that one year. I didn't personally like the way it tasted, so I don't really grow that anymore. But I know a couple people that maintain their New Zealand or their Okinawa spinach, which are really very similar plants. The reason I don't grow those is because they are perennials. And they do have a tendency, if we get a real hard frost, they're not going to make it unless they're covered. But those are just some options for you. As far as getting seeds or starts for that, I'd think, the New Zealand and the Okinawa spinaches would be difficult to find, but Malabar spinach is very easy to find here in North Florida. Asian greens. We have a master gardener that really, Doug Collins is his name. He specializes in Asian type of foods, and he's really good at growing this. And matter of fact, when I put this together, this presentation together, I asked him in particular of anything that he would suggest, and he said the Tatsoi and the Savoy really do very well here, and they're very very spinach-like in the way that they taste. So those are some options that you have, and you'll get some nice green leafies out of it. Something different for your salads. And here again, here's another one, Amaranth. If you've never had it, very unique tasting. The thing that's really important if you're going to grow this, and I grew this one year, it's prolific. It will take over whatever space you're going to put it in. but you got to get rid of it before. I didn't do this, so I'm speaking from experience. I didn't get rid of it before it bloomed. It went to seed, and I had amaranth popping up on me for literally until I had a hard frost. So, but it's very unique tasting. Eggplants. Who doesn't love eggplants? It's mandatory for me to grow this because my wife absolutely loves eggplants. There's a lot of different types. I've had tremendous success with the Black Beauty, which is one of the ones I have, and the Ichiban. Now, the Ichiban is the long, slender, and it's not so dark purple. The big picture is the Black Beauties, which are real dark purple. And yes, I do eat a lot of eggplant parmesan in the summertime around the Shupi household. Okay, okra. Another one I love to grow. It does really well here. I personally like to pickle this. It is tough. This is a very easy crop to grow. It is a prolific producer. Even if you only plant a couple of plants, 2 or 3 or 4 plants, you are going to have a ton of okra. So if you're a big fan of any of the okra dishes, fried okra, gumbo, or pickling okra, which I love, those that you should consider doing this in the summertime. Chayote. I grew this one time. I will admit I was not very successful, but I only grew 2 plants. I trellised it. I don't know what I did wrong because I was very unfamiliar with it, but I did get some fruit. It's a very interesting flavored fruit. It is a fruit. It's not a vegetable. It's a vining plant. And they get to be about, well, mine got to be about the size of a small pear. And it's kind of a combination. I would describe it as kind of a potato, kind of an avocado, but it tastes sweeter. It's got great crunchy texture, kind of like a cucumber texture. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting plant. I just personally was not successful with this plant. It would be interesting to grow it again, but then again, for me personally, I'm not super enthusiastic about it, so I wouldn't necessarily grow it unless I wanted to do some kind of experimentation with it. Very interesting to grow, though. Sweet potatoes, lots of people grow sweet potatoes here. The biggest thing you got to know about sweet potatoes, if you're going to grow them across the summer, you should probably get them in the soil now because they take their time finishing. I've had sweet potatoes go 180 days on me, so a full 6 months to get them out of the ground. But if you plant them now, 6 months from now is, well, we're having Thanksgiving, so your time is about right. The other things that's interesting about sweet potatoes is a lot of people don't know this, but you can eat the entire plant, not just the tubers, but the leaves and the stalks and the roots and the whole thing. You got to cook them, and I've never done it, but I've heard from several people here in the Gainesville area that will eat the leaves as they go along, actually. So it is very nematode susceptible, though. That's something to keep in mind. All right, this is, in my opinion, the funnest thing to grow if you have young kids or if you have grandkids. I call these red loop beans. They're traditionally marketed as yard-long beans. They're very fun to grow. They taste pretty good. It's very much like a green bean, but it gets, I mean, Jiminy Crickets, I've had them grow 3 feet long on me. I thought they were only, when I first planted these, I thought, oh, okay, well, they'll be about 1 foot long. And I planted them when my children were small. And they're just a gas, and they will grow quite long. And unfortunately, at the time, I had an 8 and a 6-year-old boys, and they decided that they were going to whip each other with those things. So just, it was more of a toy for them, but it's really kind of it's a fun thing to grow. And the kids are like, because they grow very rapidly. It's like, you'll see a bean pod, and 3 or 4 days later, it will be 7 or 8 inches longer than it was when you take them back out to show them. And again, like I had said, and I mentioned on the screen here, they will get up to 3 feet long. They're really neat plants. It's fun to grow those. Wing beans. These are interesting. I did grow these one year, quite a long time ago, because I'm not a super big fan of them. And I learned that you have to pick these plants when they are about, at the most, 2 inches long. If you let them get too big, they get real tough. And even if you cook them to death, they still are pretty tough because they get fibrous. They have a very interesting flavor too. But you have to pick them early, and they're readily available. You'll find these seeds for wing beans around town. I happen to find these at a big box store here in town. So, I mean, I saw it and I never had grown it, so I grabbed that seed pack and tried it that particular year. At Zuki beans, I've never grown these. I've, of course, bought them, and they make great beans and rice rather than just traditional red beans. But they do very, very well in the summertime. They're prolific in the Southeast Asia area of the world, and they dry very well, as we know. Lima beans. I will never grow lima beans because I don't like them. I don't like eating lima beans, Sam I am. But they do very well here in North Florida. I have never grown them. Now you're asking, well, if you've never grown them, how do you know if they've been well? Well, I've known gardeners, some other master gardeners, that have told me when I put this presentation together, that they have great success planting lima beans here in North Florida, that they are very heat tolerant and they are top producers. So if you like those type of beans, by all means, please grow them this summer. Roselle. Well, this is something that I do have, and I actually like it quite a bit. And I will have to say I look forward to going to the Master Gardener meetings in the early fall, because we always have Roselle, or cranberry hibiscus. A lot of people call it Florida cranberries. I love Roselle tea. It tastes wonderful. I like it sweetened. It's one of the only teas I like sweetened. But it's a very nutritious. There's a lot of vitamin C that you get out of a glass of, if you have 2 glasses of Roselle that's been brewed properly, you're getting 100% of your USDA recommended dosage of vitamin C for that day. Cassava, yucca. I have a yucca plant. What's interesting, and I do use that, and I dig a tuber out, and I treat it more like, a lot of people will use the tubers and cut them into French fries and fry them. I've had that. They're actually quite good. I use it for a different purpose, though. I will take the tuber. I will take a tuber out of my yucca plant usually every 2 years, because I don't have to take a lot. But what I use it for is I treat it like turmeric, in that I dry it and then I powderize it, grind it into a powder. And then very little bit of it works as a surfactant in your water. Now, that's a whole nother subject, and maybe we'll get to that in another presentation, but a surfactant basically helps break water molecules apart so it sheets and it disperses better on the surface of your plants and in your soil. Jicama. I'm not a fan of jicama. I have grown it just out of curiosity. I do not like the way that it tastes, but it does do very well here. It comes it's native to Mexico, and it is a prolific grower. I have tried it both where they produce beans. The beans are not edible. You can't eat them. I've harvested the jicama prior to the beans maturing and after the beans matured, and I didn't like either version. They do taste different. They're better, in my opinion, when it was after the beans were matured. It tasted nuttier, but I just personally did not care for this, but it did do very well. Seminole pumpkins. Who doesn't love some Seminole pumpkins? They flourish here, obviously. And calabaza is a cousin to the Seminole pumpkin. If you're going to plant these, get them in the soil now. You'll have yourself some really nice Seminole pumpkins come the fall. And I have had a lot of different things. I've had Seminole pumpkin pie. I've had Seminole pumpkin cookies. I've had Seminole pumpkin coffee cake. I've had a lot of different things from a lot of different people that do grow this. I have not grown this but one time because it's, you know, so many people grow it here. And they're very easy to obtain. Okay, some hot weather herbs. Well, I mentioned one of them already, turmeric, and thankfully one of our other master gardeners that is here in Alachua County commercially produces turmeric on her farm down in Micanopy, and I have quite a nice crop of this. I followed her instructions, and I harvested around Thanksgiving every year. I dry it out and I grind it into a powder and I take it every single day. It's a noticeable difference if I don't take it anymore. Ginger root, I do grow edible gingers along with the several other flowering gingers. They do very well here in the summertime. Culantro is very, very similar in its flavor to cilantro. And what's neat about that is cilantro, of course, does very well here. Coriander is another name for cilantro, does very well in the wintertime here, and culantro does very well in the summertime here. So if you like that flavor and you like that flavor used in your cooking, there you can get that flavor profile basically by growing one in the summer and one in the fall and winter. All right, soil. I put this in here because we always get a tremendous amount of questions, and because I do spend a lot of time on cover crops and how I build soil. I can't, when it comes to this particular subject, just in my opinion, I'm a soil gardener is what I tell people. I grow soil, and the plants that I put into it, I don't eat the soil, obviously, but in a way you kind of do, because the soil is the most, in my opinion, the most important thing in your garden. If you take care of your soil, it's going to take care of your plants, and your plants are going to flourish. So obviously here, the soil is very naturally sandy here. So I would tell you that adding compost and manures are going to greatly benefit you. Especially if you're in a raised bed garden, you definitely want to include that organic matter to keep your soil food web alive. And I put in there pH because a lot of people we have a very alkaline soil here. It's very phosphorus rich. So a lot of times you gotta acidize your soil, and there's ways to do that, and that's kind of a whole nother subject. Seeds or transplants. I've said that I do most of my stuff from transplants. There's very few things that I go directly from seed when I go into a cover crop. Transplants, obviously, you can get transplants at any one of the farm stores or big box stores, and from that you get an instant garden. A lot of people don't have a lot of success when they're starting some of their fall crops, just going from seed directly into soil because it's still too hot, so the seeds don't readily germinate, especially when you talk about broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. Those type of cold crops need a little bit cooler soil temperature in order for those seeds to germinate, which is why I like to use transplants, and I typically will start those indoors where the temperature is a constant 77, 78, 79 degrees. All right, watering your garden. What's recommended, and this really comes right out of the IFAS library, 1 to 2 inches of water per week. Now, most of the time, I know I put a picture in there of a gentleman watering his garden with a sprinkling system. But what's nice about here in North Florida is we oftentimes get 1 or 2 inches a week from Mother Nature, and which is very beneficial, obviously, so you don't necessarily need the excess. The only problem with Mother Nature is she generally shows up in the afternoon rather than the morning. Okay, fertilizing into your garden. If you're gonna, and here's a podcast for us, Taylor, explaining fertilizer labeling and understanding fertilizer labeling. I would tell you that your summer vegetables, they are very dependent on fertilizer in the soil. They're heavy. Everything that I really kind of covered today are heavy feeders. So the suggestion, and this again comes right from the IFAS library, is fertilizing every 3 weeks during the summer growing season. Garden care, I can't stress it enough. Scouting early and often for insects, disease, pests are a problem, disease is a problem. And when you see it, it needs to be treated, or it needs to be addressed immediately, because otherwise it gets out of hand very quickly here in North Florida. Some of the pests that you're going to see, and this is just a few of them. You've got obviously the hornworm. If you have chickens, your chickens will love that hornworm. Plant bugs, and well, the leaf-footed bug is, we will see a lot of pierce-sucking insects in the summertime. That's why I included that photo. They love to camp on your tomatoes and suck them dry if they can. Aphids are always a problem here. I put fire ants because they're very active in the summertime, and I put squirrels because, believe it or not, the dearth of the year, okay, meaning the lack of food for wildlife, occurs in the summertime here. So squirrels will be very active seeking your food out in your garden in the summertime. Okay, strategies for making it through the summer. I personally, I can't stress this enough. I personally think my strategy is very beneficial because I leave here in the summertime. So, and I know there's probably plenty of people on this presentation or that will watch this video that say, hey, I get out of Gainesville in the summertime, and a lot of people do. The town gets pretty empty. They're gone for a month or two because it's just so darn hot. Well, that's why I use cover crops. I plant my cover crops. I'm gone for 60 days or 45 days, and I come back and chop it down and get it ready for the fall garden. But I can't stress it enough. You got to water in the morning time. Weed often, be on the lookout for pests. But I would tell you, if you're going to spray something, whether it be organic or synthetic, for pest control, I suggest doing that in the evening time. The reason that I do that right now would be a perfect time, just before the sun sets. The reason for that is because your pollinators have left for the day. They're gone. They've gone back to their house. They've collected their pollen and their nectar for the day, and they're out of your garden typically by now or a little bit later than now. Like if you can hit that point where it's still light out, but the sun has dipped below the horizon, that's your time period. You got a good 10 minutes in there that you can apply insecticides if you need to do that, or fungicides, any of the disease things that are going to pop up in the summertime here. The other thing that I would strongly encourage, and I put it in here as a line item, is because it is so darn humid and we get very stagnant air here, is you want to increase your plant spacing. I typically say this: if you're a square foot gardener, that's a very popular methodology. Take whatever the square. I say take your square, instead of having a 1 foot square, do a 18-inch square or a 16-inch square, something to that effect, and plant the same number of plants that you should plant in that amount of space, because it just allows for an increase of airflow when we do get some, and it's going to keep especially the funguses down a little bit. Okay, let's talk about those pollinators very quickly here. This is another thing that's really beneficial because these pollinator plants really thrive in the summer here. And I've pictured a few of them: Mexican sunflowers, Traditional sunflowers will do extremely well here. Galeria does fantastic here. A lot of the wildflowers will do. And your pollinators are also experiencing a dearth during this time period. So having those plants available to them as a summer crop is wonderful for them. So that's basically it. I left this up on the screen. If you have questions too, I don't know, Taylor, if you want to come in here, I can't see if there are questions. I have a little time for some questions, but I also put, obviously, our help desk. There's nobody really there to man the help desk, I don't believe, Taylor.
We do have our help desk available. No one is there. The office is currently closed. All the other agents, we're all working from remote locations. But you can still call the office, and you can send any questions to our Master Gardener help desk. And I just put that email address into the chat box. Is that mag@alachuacounty.us.
Okay, very good. And please, I would tell you, visit us on Facebook if you can. I have the address up there also. And now that we've just gotten out of the gate, and I know that Taylor and I are very excited with our podcast. And we did a podcast with regards to this topic. We have a few other episodes already up. You can look for that on Apple, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify. Please, have a listen as we build our library of podcasts. It should be quite entertaining.
Yeah, and we just did get a question that came into the chat that someone was asking about organic, like fertilizers. What do you use? I know one of the most common ones that a lot of homeowners use is like fish emulsion, and for the fertilizer and for some like insecticide sprays. It really depends on what you want to use or what you're spraying for. Like
correct.
BT is a common one for like our soft body insects. What do you use specifically, Scott, for besides BT?
BT is definitely on my roster. There are products out there. There are neem products. A lot of people have a difficulty using neem oil and soap solutions because obviously oil and water doesn't really mix, and it's very difficult to emulsify without foaming the daylights out of the soap. But there are products out there that are neem derivatives. You're looking for a chemical that's called azadirachtin. And I think Taylor can probably type that out in the chat box.
Spell it.
I think I could probably, it's spelled just like it sounds, AZERDACTIN, I think it is. I'm not 100% sure, but that's the chemical that is found in neem that does the trick. And I mix that with a peppermint Castile soap. You don't use a lot of soap. The soap is really there to kind of hold the azadirachtin on the leaf surface or on the fruit surface. As far as fertilizers go, my methodology, and boy, this is a whole nother, it's funny.
Whole other program.
Yeah. And I gave a presentation, maybe it was either last year or the year before that, on my organic system, and I quickly realized that it is impossible to give that class in an hour-and-a-half setting. It really needs to be
an organic garden
over
workshop.
Maybe a 4 or 6 week time period. But to answer your question, what do I use as far as fertilizers? I would tell you one of the fertilizers I put up. I'm very hesitant to use name branding, but I'll give you a few that are readily available. Dr. Earth, you'll find that at the big box stores. And I put that up because it is available at the big box stores, and it is a decent organic fertilizer. My system incorporates, I am very reliant on the soil food web. and I drive that soil food web. Worms, I consider worms employees, believe it or not. I use rock dusts. I use compost. Compost obviously drives a lot of that. And then compost tea drives a lot of that. But and again, that is literally, I could teach a semester on that, and a lot of people would still struggle. I mean, because I would tell you that I still, is my system perfected? I think I'm chasing it. I'm chasing perfection. Have I gotten a lot better at it? Yes. But I started working in earnest. I mean, seriously focusing on producing purely organic food for my family back in 2008. So I've been doing it now for 12 years. And I'm still chasing perfection when it comes to that. So, but here's a way to think about it. I think I think whoever asked that question is barking up the right tree, because prior to 1860, when when a German scientist figured out that plants love nitrogen and started to produce nitrogen synthetically, all agriculture prior to 1860 was organic. So that's, that's one way to look at it. But then right around that same time period, what happened, the Industrial Revolution was really launching. And since then, we have greatly drained the Earth's mineral content, the soil mineral content. And so replenishing that is what is really the most difficult part. Any other questions? I hope that answered your question. I'm reluctant to give you brand names that you can go out and buy, simply because
don't necessarily
the university really doesn't, I can't promote. It's not that I don't have something I could point you at, but I really am kind of tied. My hands are a little bit tied in, specifically saying, hey, this product or that product, because the university is not going to promote specific products.
We do, if you do want to reach out to our Master Gardener Help Desk, that mag@alachuacounty.us, we do have a list of resources that we can send you. Well, awesome. So one person on here said that this is their first time starting a vegetable and herb garden. It's a 4 by 16 foot space. It's full of sand. And they want to make sure they're doing it within a budget because they're living within a rented place, which I do not blame you. I actually know someone that designed their raised bed so they can pack it up and move with it because it folds up the walls and everything. But anyways, but the question was, should I just do a 4 by 4 wood box and add soil to separate from all of the sand?
My first question would be how long do you plan on living there? Because if you develop really good soil, you're going to want to move the soil. Now, I will tell you from firsthand experience, having moved soil, that is a giant pain in your backside. I would tell you, because just given the parameter that eventually you probably are going to move, hopefully you'll get your own place.
1.5 years, yes.
Okay, fantastic. I look at 1.5 years, well, Jiminy Crickets, that's 4 or 5 cycles that you could go. I would tell you, do a couple of those 4-foot boxes. You can certainly incorporate some of our native soil, but just understand that if you do that, you're going to have nematodes. They're just going to be there. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts around that. Okay. The way that I do, the way that I build my raised beds is I build my own soil. Matter of fact, I put up a video on a Facebook group called Gainesville Grows about how I build my soil. I'm very reliant on a lot of different composts, different type of composts. I would suggest that, and if you're going to go that route, if you're going to fill a box, you know, at least make it 12 inches deep. And I would tell you to put a layer of cardboard between, if you don't want nematodes at all, well, they're coming no matter what, but put a layer of cardboard on the native surface and then build on top of that. That's the fastest, that's the longest route for the nematodes to take. Now, understand, nematodes are, I stress it because they're so prolific here in North Florida, and they don't get, nothing kills them, but they're microscopic. A long journey, now picture a long journey. If we had to walk, what would be a long walk in a year's time for a human being? Well, let's just say it'd be 3,000 miles. Could you walk across the entire United States in a year? Yes, you could. So that journey, that would be an arduous journey to walk for a human being. A nematode at its maximum speed in the course of a year is going to move about 2 inches. So if you got 12 inches of soil, contacting native soil, it's going to be 6 years before they make it to the surface. And that's only going to be like that's the Usain Bolts of nematodes are going to, you know, that can move that fast. But they're going to be there. Even if you put the cardboard down, they're coming. I had one of the soil scientists at UF actually was studying whether or not nematodes can, when we, you know, can get picked up off the surface of the soil and get airborne in wind. So, and I thought, man, I please keep me abreast of that research. That's very interesting, because if that proves to be accurate, well, they're going to be there this year then. So I would suggest, because I think you're going to have greater success building soil, but if you're going to go with the natural soil, hey, there's farmers all over Alachua County that are planting directly into our native soil. Just incorporate a fair amount of organic matter, whether that be composts or, you know, there's just a variety of things. And I would encourage you to do a variety of composts. So not just, you know, composted dairy or beef manure, but get some mushroom compost, maybe get some cocoa coir or some sag and peat moss, and incorporate all those things, because you're going to have different mineral holding properties throughout those different strata. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, and they did have a final, another question is like, where do I put the cardboard?
Put it right. Picture your 4x4. You've got your 4 foot by 4 foot box built. Okay. The first thing you're going to put inside of that box is a layer of cardboard. The very first thing. So it's going to be on the bottom of the box.
Perfect. We did have one question come up. Someone asked, are there some things that we can plant now and have harvested this summer? So that made me think of a good publication I'm actually going to share in the chat box right now. But it is a publication from the university about how to grow veggies and herbs in the shade or shadier conditions in North Florida. So essentially it can extend what type of plants we can grow during our hot time of the year. And even though sometimes it takes a while for some of our plants to be able to harvest, but if you're wanting to look at some things that if you plant underneath that shade cloth, you can actually get like beets and turnips and plant those through June. And they typically have a really quick turnaround time before you can harvest them, and you can plant a lot of them in a very small space.
That's true. That's very accurate. The key there is going to be underneath that shade cloth, because they need a cooler temperature. So the other thing that comes to mind immediately, and it's one of my favorite summertime dishes, is cherry tomatoes. One of the farm stores or big box stores will have transplants available that are cherry style tomatoes. If you can find Sun Glow in particular, because I know those do very well, but all the cherry tomatoes do very well. And Caprese Salad is just a super refreshing summertime dish, in my opinion. Sorry, but that, you know, that is going to be, you know, if you put a transplant in now, you should have a crop start to produce 60 days from now pretty easily.
Yeah. So, are there any other questions? All right. One of our master gardeners mentioned that he's still harvesting pak choy and Swiss chard right now that he planted back in January.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I did put a link in the chat box. I'll repost this one again. But this is a survey, just a follow-up survey. We'd like to know, just get a little bit of feedback. It takes just like a minute or so. This is a great way that we use to kind of always make sure that our program is growing and developing, and we're able to, you know, try to give it a bigger impact. So thank you, Scott, very much for helping lead us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the IFAS Extension Alachua County office, and we'll be able to help provide the different resources or help answer a lot of the questions that you may have. So thank you all very much.